I thought being escorted out of the company I kept alive for 20 years was my lowest point. I was wrong. Just hours later, the executives who called me obsolete stared at red screens, stranded trucks, and millions of dollars bleeding down the drain. Those servers did not crash naturally. Somebody needed them to fail. I am not just going to survive this. I will let their entire tower of lies collapse right on top of them. My name is Riley Bailey. I am 41 years old, and for the last 19 of those years, I have been the nervous system of Stratodyne Fulfillment Systems. As the system reliability architect, my job was not to make the company look pretty for investors. My job was to make sure that when a massive warehouse in Columbus, Ohio, lost power during a blizzard, the supply chain kept moving without missing a single beat. I built the invisible safety nets that held the entire enterprise together. It was exactly 5:45 in the evening on a Tuesday when the calendar alert popped up on my screen. A mandatory touch base in the executive glass conference room. We called it the glass box. That was the very first sign of trouble. You do not get invited to the glass box at the end of the day to discuss a promotion or a technical breakthrough. You go there to be disappeared. Walking down the long, carpeted hallway, I could feel the deep, steady hum of the servers a floor below us. It was a comforting rhythm, a mechanical heartbeat I knew intimately. But the moment I pushed open the heavy glass door of the conference room, the atmosphere violently shifted. The air conditioning was turned down to a freezing temperature, though I strongly suspected the chill actually radiated from the two people waiting for me inside. Vivienne Hart, our newly minted chief executive officer, sat perfectly straight at the head of the polished mahogany table. She wore a tailored charcoal blazer that cost more than my first car, and her hands were folded tightly over a perfectly organized manila folder. Leaning against the wall to her right was Evan Crow. He was the Director of Operations Technology, a title he had acquired roughly 8 months ago along with an oversized ego and a wardrobe of aggressively tight turtlenecks. "Have a seat, Riley," Vivian said. Her voice was perfectly modulated, carrying the sterile, practiced warmth of an automated customer service line. I did not sit. I stood at the opposite end of the long table, resting my hands on the cool leather of the chairback. "What is this about? Vivian?" Vivian offered a thin smile that completely failed to reach her eyes. Stratodyne is entering a new phase of aggressive growth. As you know, we are heavily focused on modernization this quarter. We need to be lean. We need to be agile. And unfortunately, that means evaluating our legacy architecture and the personnel inextricably tied to it. It was a perfectly rehearsed corporate word salad, but the actual translation was abundantly clear. Evan had finally gotten to her. I shifted my gaze to Evan. He was practically vibrating with smugness, a small, victorious smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He crossed his arms over his chest, deliberately letting his expensive watch catch the harsh overhead lighting. For the past 6 months, Evan had been constantly whispering in Vivian's ear, painting me as a stubborn relic of the past. He hated that I was the only woman in the building who understood the absolute bedrock of the company. He hated that my code did not feature flashy graphical interfaces or trending buzzwords. Most of all, he despised that he could not comprehend the complex fail-safes I had built. So, rather than learn, he decided to convince the board that my meticulously crafted safety protocols were actually operational bottlenecks. "We are letting you go, Riley," Vivian continued, her tone turning brisk and incredibly final. "Effective immediately. Human Resources has already scheduled your access credentials for deactivation. Your building pass has been revoked. We have arranged a standard severance package, provided you sign the enclosed non-disclosure agreement. There is a security officer waiting by the ground floor reception desk right now to escort you out of the building." I looked down at the closed manila folder. I quickly realized this was not a performance review. It was not a discussion or an opportunity to defend my work. It was a pre-signed execution. I had spent nearly 2 decades ensuring this logistics company never experienced a single second of unplanned downtime, and they were tossing me out into the street like an expired software license. I did not yell. I did not plead for my job. I simply looked directly at Evan. "I have one question. I said, keeping my voice level. Who is handling right conflicts tonight? Evan's smirk widened into a full, arrogant grin. He uncrossed his arms and pushed himself off the wall, walking 2 steps toward the table as if he had just won a grand debate. Always with the dramatic doomsday scenarios. Riley, nobody is holding your clunky conflict resolution lock. We do not need it anymore. And who is managing time drift between the regional clusters? I asked. Who is reconciling the data when the East Coast starts lagging behind the Midwest? You still do not get it, do you? Evan laughed. The old safety layers are gone. I migrated the back end to a single real-time core this afternoon. It is cloud native, synchronized across regions, and a lot cleaner than the system you built. We do not need regional failover logging slowing us down just because you are afraid of packet loss. I stared at him in absolute silence. For a long moment, the sheer magnitude of his technical arrogance actually took my breath away. And single real-time core, without regional failsafes, operating under the crushing weight of fourth-quarter traffic. Right then and there, the grim reality crystallized in my mind. Evan had not just fired me, he had stripped out the safeguards that kept our regional systems from colliding under peak traffic. With the holiday rush already surging, the first serious right conflict would spread across the network faster than anyone in that room could stop it. It was not going to happen in a few weeks or a few days. It was going to happen tonight. The system was going to literally tear itself to pieces, cannibalizing its own database in a desperate, blind attempt to synchronize data that fundamentally could not be synchronized. I see, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. I am glad you finally understand, Vivian said, aggressively sliding the manila folder across the slick wooden table toward me. Please pack your personal items quickly. I could have warned them. I could have grabbed a marker, drawn a diagram on the whiteboard, and explained exactly how the unified core was going to violently collapse under the current transaction volume. I could have begged them to immediately roll back the migration to save their own careers. But why would I? They had already revoked my administrative access. They had a security guard waiting downstairs to treat me like a common criminal. I turned around without taking the folder and walked out of the glass room. I went straight to my desk in the main engineering bullpen. I did not log into my workstation. I did not touch a single line of code. I did not change a single password, nor did I delete any documentation. I left absolutely no traps behind. I gave them zero excuses to legally blame me for the catastrophic failure that was about to unfold. I reached out and grabbed my old, chipped ceramic coffee mug. I gathered 3 spiral-bound personal notebooks filled with my own handwritten notes and tucked them neatly under my arm. That was all I took. 19 years of my professional life, boiled down to a stained mug and some lined paper. The walk to the elevator felt incredibly long, yet I felt entirely detached from my physical surroundings. The open-plan office was starting to clear out for the evening. A few junior developers gave me highly confused looks as I walked past them with my meager belongings, my posture completely rigid, my back perfectly straight. I did not look back at them. I rode the elevator down to the lobby in total silence. The security guard was waiting by the front desk, exactly where Vivian said he would be. He gave me a highly sympathetic nod, clearly uncomfortable with his assigned duty. I reached into my pocket and handed him my plastic key card, without uttering a single word. I walked through the heavy revolving glass doors and stepped out into the crisp Ohio evening air. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, casting long, pale shadows across the concrete pavement. When the lobby doors clicked shut behind me, permanently sealing me out of the building I had practically built from the inside out, the anger did not hit me. I truly thought I would be furious. I thought I would be devastated to the point of tears. Instead, I felt a deep, freezing certainty settling heavily into my bones. Evan Crow wanted to be the architect of the future. He desperately wanted a single real-time core to impress people who did not understand computers. He was about to get exactly what he asked for. They had just confidently thrown out the only person on the entire payroll who knew exactly how the dominoes were set up, and much more importantly, they had thrown out the only person who knew how to stop them from falling. I walked toward my car, pausing briefly to look up at the illuminated windows of the server floor on the third story. It was quiet now, peaceful, even, but I knew the absolute truth. The countdown had already started. When I first walked through the doors of Stratadine, the company was nothing more than a scrappy logistics software vendor operating out of a repurposed brick warehouse with terrible plumbing. We were not serving the sleek tech giants of Silicon Valley. Our clients were the overlooked, exhausted backbone of the American supply chain. We built software for distribution centers in the rural Midwest, trucking hubs in the Deep South, and fulfillment warehouses stationed at the absolute edge of the desert. These were harsh environments where a stable internet connection was a rare luxury, not a corporate guarantee. I spent my late 20s and most of my 30s building the regional failover logging that kept our warehouses running when networks failed. The concept was incredibly unglamorous, but it was the holy grail of reliability. If a massive blizzard knocked out the network lines across 3 states, the local warehouse operations did not stop. The floor managers did not have to panic and switch to paper clipboards. My conflict resolution buffer automatically kicked in. The local servers would continue to scan barcodes, print shipping labels, dispatch freight trucks, and adjust local inventory counts without missing a single beat. The system acted like a highly intelligent, localized vault. It recorded every single action locally, held onto the data like a tightly guarded secret, and the very millisecond the network reconnected, it synchronized with the central database flawlessly. For well over a decade, that unshakable architecture was our golden ticket. It was the sole reason the massive interstate retail chains abandoned our heavily funded competitors and signed multi-year contracts with us. We delivered uninterrupted service, we promised absolute zero downtime, and we actually delivered it. Everything changed when the original founders decided to cash out. They sold the company to a massive private equity firm out of New York, and almost overnight, the very oxygen inside the building shifted. The brilliant, gritty engineers who built the company were quietly pushed down to the windowless lower floors. The expansive top floors were entirely taken over by marketing executives, venture capital liaisons, and people who wore custom-tailored suits to look at spreadsheets. Reliability was suddenly taken for granted. The new corporate gods were marketing buzzwords and aggressive growth metrics designed exclusively to serve the next round of funding. Then came Evan Crow. He arrived with a resume heavily padded with shiny Ivy League degrees and absolutely zero actual days spent standing on a freezing warehouse floor. He possessed this infuriating, polished ability to speak entirely in empty corporate slogans, projecting his voice across conference rooms like he was delivering a keynote speech to thousands of adoring fans. From his very first day as our new director of operations technology, he looked at my infrastructure with pure, unadulterated disgust. It was simply because he did not build it, and more importantly, he could not easily explain it on a single, brightly colored presentation slide. During a major quarterly strategy meeting just 4 months ago, Evan made his true intentions known. He stood at the head of the polished table, waving an expensive laser pointer at a heavily oversimplified diagram. "We are carrying too much old infrastructure," Evan declared, pointing at the box that represented my fail-safes. "This back-end is a legacy maze. We need to be cloud first. We need something lean, streamlined, and easier to present to the board. They do not care about regional failover logging. They want a system that looks modern." I sat in my chair, gripping my pen so tightly my knuckles turned completely white. He was standing there, effortlessly insulting the complex lifeline that kept our clients from losing millions of dollars a day, calling it not sexy enough for the future. I refused to let him destroy the foundation without a fight. Over the course of the next 8 weeks, I worked late into the night compiling rigorous, mathematically sound risk simulations. I printed out massive reports detailing the exact dangers of time drift between regional zones. I explained, in detail, how likely right conflicts would become if every transaction was forced into a single real-time core without a conflict resolution buffer. If a server in California processes an order just 1/100th of a second before a server in New York, and they both try to write to a single core without a localized buffer. The system panics. It causes an infinite loop of errors. I handed these heavy binders directly to Vivian Hart. I warned her that stripping away our safety layers just to make the corporate portfolio look sleeker for potential buyers was practically begging for a catastrophic, company-ending failure. Vivian did not even bother to open the reports. She rested her manicured hand on the cover, offered me a patronizing smile, and gently pushed the binder back toward me. "I appreciate your thoroughness as always, Riley," Vivian said smoothly, "but we are pivoting toward a more aggressive market strategy. I need solutions that make us look decisive and agile, not solutions that highlight our fear of potential outages." She did not want the truth. She only wanted a narrative that would inflate the company valuation before the end of the fiscal year. But the true final nail in the coffin, the moment I knew my days were permanently numbered, happened exactly 2 weeks before they finally escorted me out. I was walking back from the server room late one evening. The executive hallway was completely dark, but the heavy oak door to Vivian's office was cracked open just a few inches. I stopped in my tracks when I heard Evans speaking. His voice was low, conspiratorial, and laced with absolute chilling arrogance. "If we want this company to look lean, clean, and highly sellable by the third quarter, we have to cut the umbilical cords," Evans said, pacing back and forth across Vivian's plush carpet. "We cannot pitch a modern software-as-a-service platform to aggressive buyers if the entire ecosystem technically relies on a few stubborn veterans who refuse to adapt to my vision. We have to eliminate the people the entire system depends on. We replace their complicated, archaic safety nets with a single, out-of-the-box core. It looks infinitely better on paper. It slashes our payroll overhead, and it makes the company entirely ready to flip." I heard the soft clinking of ice against crystal as Vivian took a sip of her drink. "Just ensure the transition is quiet," Vivian replied coldly. "I do not want any operational hiccups when we show the new dashboard to the investors next month." Standing out there in the darkened hallway, my blood ran completely cold. It was never actually about optimizing the software. It was never about making the system faster or more reliable. It was purely about optics and corporate greed. They were dressing the company up for a quick, lucrative sale, and my relentless insistence on actual functional stability was ruining their beautiful illusion. They were not just targeting my job title or my salary. They were actively trying to assassinate the entire philosophy of technical resilience that I had spent nearly 20 years proving right. They wanted to build a beautiful, fragile glass house, and they were furious that I kept pointing out the rapidly approaching hurricane. They honestly believed that because they owned the company, they could simply mandate reality to bend to their beautiful presentation slides. They were about to learn a very expensive lesson. Code does not care about corporate titles. Servers do not care about venture capital funding rounds. When you rip out the foundation of a skyscraper to save a few dollars on concrete, the building does not care who signed the demolition order. It just falls. At 11 minutes past 2 in the morning, the East Coast processing cluster experienced its very first localized panic. It started as a microscopic anomaly, a tiny digital tremor that nobody in the executive suites was awake to notice. A massive logistics hub in Pennsylvania registered a bulk shipment of consumer electronics as successfully loaded and dispatched. Simultaneously, the receiving facility in New Jersey recorded that same exact inventory as entirely missing. Meanwhile, a third warehouse down in Maryland frantically generated duplicate outbound manifests for the exact same pallets. The numbers simply no longer matched. Orders flashed onto the warehouse dashboards like spectral apparitions, only to vanish into thin air a fraction of a second later. The system, stripped of its safeguards and now running through a single real-time core, tried to reconcile the conflicting updates on its own. Under the old architecture, my conflict resolution buffer would have quarantined the mismatch and resolved it before anything touched the central database. Without it, every attempted fix created another write conflict, and the damage spread faster with each pass. The physical consequences manifested with terrifying speed. In under 40 minutes, the digital seizure paralyzed the physical world. Across the entire eastern seaboard, hundreds of handheld barcode scanners suddenly emitted harsh, flat rejection tones, completely locking warehouse workers out of their batches. High-speed thermal printers, which usually spat out shipping labels at a blinding pace, abruptly halted, leaving miles of blank paper hanging in the cold warehouse air. At the massive distribution bays, lines of heavy diesel trucks began to back up toward the main highways. Drivers leaned on their horns. Completely stranded, they could not load cargo, and they could not drop freight off. The entire arterial network of the supply chain was suffering a massive, coordinated heart attack. Then came the retry storm. Because the handheld scanners and local terminals were not receiving confirmation from the central database, their automated programming told them to send the requests again and again. Millions of tiny data packets slammed against the unified core, demanding immediate validation that the core was completely unable to provide. The processing units of the central servers redlined, their cooling fans screaming as they tried to handle a volume of traffic they were never designed to process without a buffer. The orchestration servers, the vital traffic controllers of the entire network, buckled under the unbearable pressure. They began to drop dead, one by one, cascading into a total blackout exactly the way I had modeled in the thick risk assessment binders that currently sat unread on my former boss's pristine desk. I was already awake. I was sitting at my kitchen island in the dark, watching the streetlights reflect off the surface of my cold tea. I did not need an active terminal to know what was happening. I could feel the collapse in my bones. My personal cell phone sat face up on the granite counter. At exactly 45 minutes past 2, the screen illuminated the dark kitchen. The first messages were frantic texts from my former colleagues in the engineering bullpen. Everything is red. The core is rejecting all rights. Please tell me you are awake. I simply watched the notifications slide across the glass. I did not reply. 10 minutes later, a text arrived from the executive assistant. Then, the phone began to physically vibrate, rattling aggressively against the stone countertop. The caller identification displayed the name of the man who had confidently escorted me out of the building just 8 hours prior. I let it ring 4 times before I pressed the green icon and brought the speaker to my ear. "What did you do?" Evan roared. His voice was entirely stripped of the arrogant, polished veneer he had worn in the glass conference room. He sounded breathless, frantic, and cornered. "The entire East Coast routing table is gone. The core is looping. You planted a back door. Did you not? You left a logic bomb in the registry out of sheer spite." I took a slow, deliberate breath. The sheer desperation in his voice was a potent, intoxicating validation. "I did absolutely nothing, Evan," I replied, keeping my voice chillingly calm and entirely devoid of emotion. I walked out with a coffee mug and 3 notebooks. "You are the one who proudly transitioned to an always-live unified architecture right before the heaviest traffic spike of the fiscal quarter. You have to fix this right now," he demanded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched panic. "Tell me the command line override. Tell me how to force the orchestration servers to bypass the corrupted logs. I know you are listening to me." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cold granite. "I have a very simple question for you. Evan, did you or did you not execute the optimization script you proposed last month? Did you shorten the backup retention window down to 1 single hour to save on cloud storage costs? And did you completely turn off the regional logging layer?" A suffocating, dead silence fell over the line. It was the heavy, damning silence of a man looking down into a terrifyingly deep abyss of his own creation. By cutting the retention window to 1 hour, he had ensured that by the time the system finished cannibalizing itself, there would be absolutely no clean backup left to restore. He had actively burned his own lifeboats to save a few fractions of a cent on server space. "That is exactly what I thought," I said, and I tapped the red button to terminate the call. The phone remained dark for exactly 3 minutes. Then it rang again. This time, it was Vivian. "Riley?" she began. The absolute second I answered the call. The smooth, practiced tone of a commanding chief executive officer had completely evaporated. She sounded exactly like a person who had just realized she was standing on the tracks with a freight train bearing down on her. We are in the middle of a catastrophic event. Half of the country is completely dark. In exactly 4 hours, the morning shift executives for our largest retail clients on the East Coast are going to wake up and discover their entire supply chain is frozen solid. I need you back in this building immediately. I am currently unemployed. Vivian, I stated flatly. You fired me. You revoked my access. You had a security guard walk me out to the parking lot. I will reverse the termination, she pleaded, the words tumbling out of her mouth in a chaotic rush. We will call it an administrative error, a misunderstanding. You can have your desk back. But I need you to log into the administrative console right this very second and stop the bleeding. I am not logging into anything, and I am certainly not returning to my old desk, I told her, my voice turning into a hard, unbreakable steel. If you want me to save this company, you are going to rehire me as an independent crisis contractor, and I have very specific terms. Name them, she snapped, though there was zero authority left behind the demand. First, you will draft a legally binding contract for an emergency rescue fee, billed at $1,000 per hour, with a guaranteed minimum of 200 hours, payable regardless of how long the actual fix takes. Second, I am granted absolute, unquestioned operational authority over the entire infrastructure. Every single technical decision runs exclusively through me. And third, while I'm actively working on the system, absolutely no one, especially not Evan, is allowed to touch a keyboard, issue a command, or even step foot inside the server control center. I could hear her ragged breathing through the speaker. She was weighing the extortionate cost of my demands against the total destruction of her multi-million-dollar corporate empire. It was not a difficult mathematical equation. I will have legal draft the paperwork and email it to your personal account in 5 minutes. Vivian finally whispered, her spirit completely broken. Just please, get in your car. Have it signed by the board before you send it, I replied. I will see you shortly. I hung up the phone. I stood up from the kitchen island, walked over to the hallway closet, and grabbed my coat. They thought they had discarded a dinosaur. They had no idea they had just handed me the keys to their entire kingdom. I was not just going back to fix their servers, I was going back to dismantle their power. When I pushed open the double heavy doors to the main network control center, the atmosphere was completely suffocating. There was no literal smoke in the air, no sparks raining down from the ceiling tiles, no dramatic alarms blaring from overhead speakers. The physical reality of a catastrophic digital collapse is far less cinematic, but infinitely more terrifying. Every single 50-inch display monitor mounted along the curved front wall was completely flooded with harsh, blinding red error warnings. Desk telephones were shrieking in a relentless, overlapping chorus that nobody was bothering to answer. A dozen senior managers were huddled in the center of the room, their voices pitched in the frantic, breathless cadence of people watching their lucrative careers evaporate in real time. Evan was standing over the primary administrative console, sweating profusely through his expensive clothes, shouting at a terrified junior systems engineer. Just power cycle the central cluster right now, Evan yelled, slamming his hand on the desk. Force a hard reboot across the board. I walked straight past him, grabbed the back of the junior engineer's rolling chair, and physically pulled him away from the keyboard. If you power cycle the central cluster while the databases are in a state of active desynchronization, I announced, making sure my voice carried over the chaos in the room, the system will blindly attempt to overwrite the last known good state with corrupted retry packets the moment it boots back up. You will permanently shred whatever intact data we have left. It will be entirely unrecoverable. Evans spun around, his face flushed with panicked rage. We have to do something, Riley. The entire network is locked up tight. We are going to do exactly what I say, I replied, sliding into the vacant chair and pulling up the master command line interface. I did not wait for his approval or Vivian's permission. I simply began typing at a blinding speed. I am officially isolating the 3 hardest-hit regions. I am manually freezing all automated inventory reconciliation engines. Furthermore, I am deploying a write block around the infected database tables. We are initiating strict quarantine routing. Vivian stepped out from the cluster of paralyzed executives, her face pale. Riley, if you freeze the automated engines, you are actively shutting down our core services. You are deliberately keeping us offline. You are already offline, Vivian, I stated coldly, not taking my eyes off the rapidly scrolling code on my monitor. Right now, your database is actively infecting itself with millions of false writes every single minute. I am offering you a choice between a controlled amputation of the corrupted sectors or letting the infection kill the entire patient. Pick one. She swallowed hard, looking at the wall of red monitors, and gave one single, definitive nod. For the next 4 hours, the control center fell into a tense, agonizing hush. I deliberately ignored the smaller accounts. I bypassed the regional logistics partners who were screaming on hold. I focused every single ounce of my cognitive capability on our largest and most lucrative client, Bexley Home Clubs. Their massive distribution network was the arterial bleeding that would bankrupt Stratodine by dawn if left unchecked. I manually constructed a temporary, highly localized bypass channel, carefully untangling their specific inbound and outbound command flows from the ruined unified core. It was excruciating, delicate work. I had to sift through thousands of lines of corrupted routing tables, matching stranded data packets to their proper physical warehouses. By 5:45 in the morning, the harsh red lights on the Bexley operational dashboard finally blinked back to a steady, calm green. Their shipping labels began printing across the eastern seaboard. Their freight trucks were cleared to move. The room let out a collective, ragged exhale. I had just bought Stratodine a very short, very fragile breathing room. While the executives immediately rushed out to the hallway to make groveling appeasement calls to the Bexley leadership, I stayed anchored to the terminal. I used the quiet moment to run a deep, unauthorized diagnostic trace on the administrative events leading up to the initial crash. I already knew from my earlier phone call that the backup retention window had been dangerously shortened, but as I dug deeper into the security logs, 3 truly terrifying details emerged from the darkness of the code. First, the retention window was not just shortened, it was practically erased, leaving us no historical buffer. Second, the automated audit alerts, the specific security alarms designed to notify the team of unauthorized architectural changes, had been completely disabled at the root level. Third, and most damning of all, a massive, anonymous hotfix had been forcefully injected into the unified core exactly 12 minutes before the first cluster failed. I turned my chair just as Evan walked back into the control center, holding a cup of coffee he clearly did not drink. What exactly was in the hotfix that was pushed into the core at 1:59 this morning? I asked quietly, ensuring my voice did not carry across the room. He flinched. It was a microscopic tightening of his jaw, a brief flash of pure panic in his eyes. But I saw it. Just routine system optimizations. He waved his free hand dismissively, avoiding my gaze. Background library updates. It has absolutely nothing to do with the crash. Do not go chasing ghosts. Riley. I turned back to my screen. Routine optimizations do not require overriding the root access protocols. A hotfix of that magnitude requires an active administrator, and my trace confirmed that the patch had bypassed standard security through a highly irregular chain of elevated administrative privileges. That is something that absolutely cannot happen organically. It requires precise, deliberate preparation. Later that night, the frantic adrenaline of the morning had faded into a dull, throbbing exhaustion. I was standing completely alone in the physical server room on the 3rd floor, enjoying the freezing air conditioning and the deafening, industrial roar of the massive cooling fans. I needed the physical proximity to the hardware to think clearly. The heavy security door clicked open, and Evans slipped inside, pushing it shut until the magnetic lock engaged. He walked down the narrow aisle of black metal racks until he was standing uncomfortably close to me. invading my personal space. Do not think for one single second that fixing Bexley makes you indispensable, Evan hissed, leaning in so I could hear him over the noise of the machines. When the dust settles on this disaster, I'm going to write the official post-mortem report for the board. I am going to make sure every single tech company in this industry knows that your antiquated, overly complicated legacy code is what caused this bottleneck. You will never find a job managing so much as a local coffee shop network when I am done dragging your name through the mud. I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice, nor did I attempt to defend my professional reputation. I just looked at his sweating face, realizing the absolute, terrifying truth of the situation. This was never a careless migration accident. The disabled security alarms, the anonymous code injection, the missing data backups. Evan had not just made a mistake out of arrogance. Someone had deliberately engineered this catastrophic failure to force a lucrative corporate transition, and more importantly, they had carefully arranged the pieces so that a disgruntled, recently fired legacy architect would take the entire fall. He wanted me to argue. He wanted me to act erratic and defensive so he could build his narrative. I simply turned my back on him without uttering a single word and walked out of the freezing room. The moment I reached my temporary desk in the darkened engineering bullpen, I pulled a small, high-capacity offline storage drive from my pocket, working entirely through an encrypted, hidden tunnel I had built years ago. I quietly copied the raw forensic logs, the entire privilege access histories, and the exact digital trace of the phantom hotfix onto the physical drive. I encrypted the file packet with a heavy cipher, drafted a short, highly secure email, and sent the digital copy directly to my personal lawyer. I was no longer just fixing a broken database to earn an emergency consulting fee. I was preserving evidence inside a corporate crime scene, and Evan still had no idea I had already documented his every move. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, I was summoned to the grand executive boardroom on the top floor. This was not the glass box where I had been fired. This was the inner sanctum, a cavernous space paneled in dark walnut, featuring a massive table carved from a single slab of imported marble. As I walked through the double doors, the atmosphere was thick with a heavy, suffocating tension. 12 members of the board of directors, mostly representatives from the private equity firm that had bought us out, sat in high-backed leather chairs. They looked exhausted, terrified, and incredibly dangerous. They did not offer me a seat among them. Instead, I was directed to a single, rigid chair, positioned at the far opposite end of the long marble table. I was not there as the savior who had just spent the entire night manually keeping their largest client from severing a multi-million-dollar contract. I was seated exactly like a hostile suspect in a criminal interrogation. Vivian sat near the head of the table, her usual polished composure replaced by a tight, brittle mask. Evan stood at the front of the room, holding a sleek remote control for the massive projection screen behind him. He looked entirely too rested for a man who had just nearly destroyed a logistics empire. "Let us begin," the chairman of the board, an older man with silver hair and a deeply lined face, announced. "We need to understand how our entire Eastern infrastructure collapsed overnight, and more importantly, who is accountable." Evan immediately clicked his remote. The screen lit up with a beautifully designed, highly sanitized presentation. The first slide featured a chaotic, tangled graphic that was clearly meant to represent my former server architecture. "The root cause of last night's catastrophic failure," Evan began, his voice projecting with the confident, practiced cadence of a seasoned salesman, "lies entirely in the legacy framework we have been desperately trying to phase out. For years, this system was built with unnecessary, convoluted complexities. It was deliberately designed to be entirely dependent on a single individual. Riley constructed a labyrinth that no modern engineering team could possibly navigate, making a standard, clean handover absolutely impossible." He clicked to the next slide, showing bold red text that read, "Single point of failure." "When we attempted to modernize the flow of data to meet our current growth metrics," Evan continued smoothly, "the underlying structural rot finally gave way. Riley intentionally built a system that refused to integrate with modern, cloud-first standards. The crash was the inevitable result of her refusing to document her customized protocols and hoarding critical operational knowledge. The board members nodded slowly, their eyes shifting toward me. Evan had painted a masterful, terrifying picture of a disgruntled, overly defensive employee who had held the company hostage through sheer technical obscurity. I did not interrupt him. I waited until the room fell completely silent. Then, I leaned forward and rested my hands flat on the cold marble surface. "Are you finished?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and completely devoid of defensive anger. I looked directly at the chairman. For the past 10 years, my so-called convoluted architecture maintained an uptime of 99.99%. We experienced less than 2 hours of cumulative unplanned downtime over an entire decade. Furthermore, my operating costs for the edge servers were exactly 40% lower than the industry standard for our closest competitors. I pulled a single sheet of paper from my pocket and slid it smoothly down the length of the table. More importantly, Evan just claimed that the legacy framework failed during his modernization attempt. That is a direct lie. The framework did not fail. The framework was actively deleted. That document contains the digital authorization logs from yesterday afternoon. It features Evan's own cryptographic signature, explicitly approving the total removal of the regional synchronization safeties and the immediate bypass of the backup delays. Evan's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. Those were necessary steps for the migration. Those were the safety brakes on a freight train, I shot back, my voice turning into a sharp blade. And you ripped them out while the train was moving at maximum velocity. A sharp-featured woman sitting halfway down the table raised her hand, cutting Evan off before he could launch into another defensive tirade. She was the lead financial representative for the equity firm. "Evan," the woman said, her tone dripping with ice. "What was the exact projected financial savings of this rapid consolidation plan you pushed through?" Evan swallowed hard, adjusting his collar. "By eliminating the regional cloud storage redundancies and unifying the core, we projected a savings of roughly $150,000 per quarter." Before anyone else could speak, I answered for him. "And the total financial damage incurred by the 45 minutes of total system paralysis you caused last night, including the contractual penalty clauses triggered by our Eastern shipping partners, currently sits at roughly $3 million. You wiped out 5 years of your projected savings before the sun even came up." The silence that followed was absolute. The math was indisputable. Vivienne, sensing the rapidly shifting tide, desperately attempted to pull the crosshairs back onto me. She leaned over the table, clasping her hands tightly. "Regardless of the financial projections, Riley, we cannot ignore the fact that your technical documentation was entirely inadequate. It was not transfer-friendly. If you had provided a clear, modernized roadmap of your architecture, the engineering team could have anticipated the load failures." I turned my gaze to Vivian, letting her see the absolute contempt in my eyes. "I submitted 4 comprehensive risk assessment reports over the last 8 weeks. Vivian, I detailed the exact cascading failure that occurred last night. I highlighted the danger of time drift. I modeled the exact retry storm that crushed the central orchestration servers. You refused to read them because they did not fit your narrative for the upcoming funding round. Ignored documentation does not equal non-existent documentation." Vivian opened her mouth to argue, but the chairman raised a hand, silencing her instantly. He looked at me with a mixture of deep resentment and undeniable desperation. They knew I had them cornered. They knew I was the only person who fully understood the bleeding puzzle pieces scattered across the server room downstairs. "We are bleeding capital every single second we remain in this vulnerable state," the chairman stated grimly. "We need stability immediately. The board is prepared to offer you a highly lucrative, temporary 6-month contract. Your mandate will be to completely finalize the system recovery, stabilize the unified core, and thoroughly supervise a transparent handover to a new, external engineering firm. Once the handover is complete, we part ways permanently." He gestured to the corporate secretary. who slid a thick, heavy legal document wrapped in a blue leather binder down the table toward me. "I require a 10-minute recess to have my legal counsel review these terms," I said, picking up the binder without opening it. The chairman nodded curtly. 10 minutes. Not 1 minute more. I stepped out of the stifling boardroom and walked down the quiet hallway to a soundproofed phone booth. I immediately scanned the document with my phone and transmitted it to my lawyer. A brilliant, ruthless contract specialist who charged an exorbitant hourly rate that I was entirely happy to pay. I stayed on the line as I heard him rapidly scrolling through the pages on his end. It took him exactly 6 minutes to find the buried landmine. "Do not sign a single page of that document, Riley." His voice crackled through my earpiece, sharp and urgent. "Go straight to Section 4, Paragraph 12, the Intellectual Property Assignment Clause." I flipped to the page. The legal jargon was dense, but the underlying intent was terrifyingly clear. "They are not just hiring you to fix the servers," my lawyer explained rapidly. "This clause is a blanket intellectual property grab. If you sign this, you are retroactively granting Stratodyne the total, exclusive, and perpetual ownership of any and all system reliability methods, architectures, and theoretical frameworks you have ever conceptualized, including anything you invent during this 6-month recovery period. They are legally claiming your brain." A cold chill radiated down my spine. The entire picture snapped into brutal, crystal clarity. This was not just about surviving a crisis. This temporary contract was a velvet guillotine. They knew my proprietary methods were infinitely more valuable than the actual servers. They wanted me to painstakingly document every single failsafe I had ever invented, hand over the legal ownership to their equity firm, and then they would kick me out into the street a second time, entirely stripped of my life's work. I would be legally barred from ever using my own architectural designs at any other company. They were using the disaster Evan created as a smokescreen to intellectually strip mine me. "Understood," I told my lawyer. "Stand by." I ended the call and stood alone in the hallway for a long moment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling city below. When I had first walked into this building yesterday, my only goal was to prove that I was right and that my work mattered. But as I held that predatory contract in my hands, my entire objective shifted. Being proven right was a vanity I no longer cared about. These people were not just incompetent. They were fundamentally predatory. They were all gathered around the table, calmly splitting up the gains from a disaster they had deliberately created, fully expecting me to hand them the pen to sign away my own future. I turned around and walked back toward the boardroom. I was not going to fix their company. I was going to find every single dirty hand hidden behind this disaster, expose the trails of money, and burn their entire corporate structure to the ground. The basement-level cafeteria of Stratodyne was a desolate place at 9 o'clock at night. The harsh, flickering fluorescent tubes hummed with a low frequency that vibrated right in the back of my skull. I was sitting alone at a sticky laminate table, staring blindly into a cup of terrible vending machine coffee, when Cole Mercer slid into the plastic booth across from me. Cole was a senior finance manager who always looked exactly 5 years older than his actual age. Tonight, the heavy, dark circles under his eyes made him look completely exhausted. He glanced nervously at the security camera mounted in the corner, though I knew for a fact it had been broken for exactly 6 months. Without a single word of greeting, Cole pushed a thick, unmarked manila envelope across the table. It stopped inches from my hands. "The accounting ledger for the Unified Core Consolidation does not make any mathematical sense, Riley," Cole whispered, his voice trembling slightly. He kept his eyes fixed on the tabletop. "I have been reconciling the departmental budgets for the last 48 hours. The capital expenditures Evan authorized over the past month are completely absurd." He was burying invoices in completely unrelated vendor categories. I pulled the envelope toward me and opened the metal clasp. Inside was a stack of heavily redacted procurement files and internal financial requisitions. The cold, sterile aesthetic of corporate espionage lay right there on the table. "What exactly am I looking at, Cole?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Look at the vendor approvals," he replied. Tapping a trembling finger on the top page, Evan expedited a massive infrastructure acquisition contract with an external cloud migration firm called CinderStack Solutions. He forced the approval through the Financial Compliance Committee exactly 3 weeks before you were fired. He paid them a retainer fee of $250,000 for services they never actually rendered. A cold spike of adrenaline hit my bloodstream. I quickly flipped through the pages. The vendor contract was incredibly specific. It detailed a rapid deployment architecture designed to entirely replace our existing logistical framework. But the true horror was buried deep in the executive compensation addendums attached to the back of the file. I found a performance bonus clause drafted explicitly for Evan Crow. It stipulated that he would receive a staggering personal payout of $750,000, entirely off the standard payroll books. If Stratodyne successfully executed an emergency migration package with CinderStack Solutions immediately following a critical disruption event, the words critical disruption event stared back at me like a loaded gun. It was a financial bounty placed directly on the head of my servers. Evan was not just an incompetent manager who made a catastrophic mistake. He was a corporate arsonist who had deliberately taken out an insurance policy right before setting the building on fire. "There is more," Cole murmured, looking over his shoulder again. I pulled his digital calendar archives. He used a private, encrypted scheduling application, but he expensed the subscription to the company card, which allowed me to trace the billing receipts. He has been taking weekly off-site lunch meetings with the regional vice president of CinderStack for the last 2 months, and they were joined by a senior partner from a boutique headhunting firm, a firm that specializes exclusively in recruiting executives immediately after a corporate merger or a major acquisition. I closed the folder, the puzzle pieces slamming together with terrifying precision. Evan knew the unified core would fail. He orchestrated the collapse to justify signing a massive, overpriced rescue contract with an outside vendor, pocketing a massive kickback in the process. Then, he planned to use the headhunting firm to parachute out of Stratodyne with a glowing resume, right before the company filed for bankruptcy. But as I looked closer at the final page of the budgetary approvals, the breath caught entirely in my throat. My eyes locked onto the digital signature authorizing the initial retainer fee for CinderStack. The signature did not belong to Evan. It belonged to our chief executive officer. Vivian Hart had personally signed the budget exception. I thanked Cole, told him to go home and absolutely forget we ever had this conversation, and walked straight to the executive suites on the top floor. The administrative assistants had all gone home. The hallway was completely dark, save for the ambient city light spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows. I opened the heavy oak door to Vivian's corner office without knocking. She was sitting behind her massive desk, nursing a glass of dark amber liquor, staring out at the glowing skyline of Columbus. I tossed the CinderStack procurement file directly onto the center of her pristine desk. The heavy paper slapped against the polished wood like a gunshot. "You signed the budget exception for a third-party migration vendor exactly 21 days ago," I stated, my voice echoing loudly in the cavernous office. "You knew Evan was planning to replace the entire architecture. You knew he was pushing me out." Vivian did not flinch. She slowly lowered her glass, her expression hardening into a cold, defensive mask. "I am the chief executive officer of a logistics empire. Riley, I signed dozens of vendor explorations every single week. Evan convinced me that CinderStack had a proprietary, out-of-the-box solution that could instantly modernize our backend and make our valuations skyrocket before the upcoming investor presentations. Evan engineered a catastrophic system collapse so he could trigger an emergency migration clause and collect a massive cash payout," I countered, leaning over the desk to force her to look me in the eyes. "He intentionally blew up the Eastern server cluster, and you handed him the matches." Vivian stood up, her composure finally cracking. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I knew he wanted you gone. Riley, I admit that. I knew his modernization timeline was aggressively accelerated. I wanted a clean, sleek growth narrative to sell to the private equity firm. I allowed him to sideline you because you were constantly screaming about the sky falling, and it was terrible for morale. but I absolutely did not know he was actually going to sabotage the core. Do you honestly think I would willingly freeze the supply chain of our biggest clients and risk going to federal prison? I stared at her for a long, silent moment. I only believed exactly half of what she said. I believe she did not explicitly order the system crash. She lacked the technical imagination to even conceive of such a brutal, targeted strike, but she was far from innocent. She saw the bright red warning lights flashing on the dashboard. She heard every single risk assessment I presented, and she actively chose to cover her eyes and press the accelerator all the way to the floor, simply because the speedometer looked impressive to her investors. She accepted the danger in exchange for a beautiful corporate lie. I turned around and walked out of her office. I did not need a confession. I needed leverage. I spent the next 4 hours sitting in the absolute darkness of my temporary workstation, digging relentlessly through the archived customer support databases and the raw, unedited security footage from our regional warehouses. The story the data told was chilling. The catastrophic crash at 2 o'clock in the morning was not a sudden, spontaneous event. It was the spectacular finale of a carefully orchestrated campaign. I found isolated, highly unusual support tickets filed by warehouse floor managers dating back 3 entire days. A barcode scanner in a Maryland facility randomly drifted out of sync by exactly 4 seconds. A thermal printer in New Jersey generated a shipping label with the destination coordinates misaligned by just 2 microscopic pixels. An inventory log in Pennsylvania showed a momentary read error that magically resolved itself within 5 milliseconds. These were not organic hardware glitches. They were tiny, deliberate digital stress tests. Someone with elevated administrative privileges had been quietly turning the invisible screws on the network, precisely measuring how much pressure the architecture could withstand before it fractured. They had been silently seeding the system with microscopic anomalies, priming the databases to violently reject the new unified core the exact second it was brought fully online. It was a masterclass in premeditated technical assassination. Sitting there in the cold glow of my monitor, completely surrounded by the undeniable proof of a massive corporate conspiracy, something inside of me fundamentally shifted. For the last 24 hours, I had been playing a desperate game of defense. I had been frantically patching holes, putting out fires, and trying to protect my own professional reputation from a boardroom full of wolves. I had been trying to save a company that had actively conspired to destroy me. That ended right now. I closed the support logs and opened a blank, highly encrypted command terminal. I was done reacting to their moves. I was the architect of this entire digital ecosystem. I built every single hallway, every locked door, and every invisible trapdoor in this vast network. Evan thought he was brilliant because he found a way to break the locks. He completely failed to realize that I owned the actual building. I began to type, my fingers flying across the keyboard with cold, terrifying precision. I was no longer trying to prove my innocence. I was going to build a trap so massive, so intricately woven into the very fabric of their precious new architecture, that the men who tried to bury me would proudly march straight into it, completely blind to the fact that the ground was about to disappear beneath their feet. Over the next 48 hours, I played the role of the dutiful, exhausted savior with absolute perfection. On the surface, I meticulously wrestled the regional clusters back online, one agonizing database table at a time. The physical atmosphere inside the network control center had fundamentally shifted. The operations managers, the junior developers, and the senior systems engineers gathered behind my workstation, watching my monitors as if they were religious artifacts. They saw me actively catching the falling sky. The frantic shouting had completely ceased, replaced by a tense, reverent silence. The entire technical staff finally understood who actually held the steering wheel of the company through the hurricane. But that public display of competence was purely for the audience. While my primary monitor displayed the standard, reassuring recovery progress bars, my secondary screen was running a deeply buried, highly classified command line interface. I was quietly reaching into the oldest layer of the system and activating the audit mirrors. These were invisible, read-only diagnostic echoes that I had engineered nearly a decade ago. They were entirely dormant under normal operating conditions. However, once I silently activated them, every single time an administrator executed a privileged command anywhere on the active network, the mirror perfectly duplicated that action. It caught a flawless reflection of the command, attached an unalterable timestamp to it, and dropped it straight into a heavily encrypted vault that Evan Crow did not even possess the technical vocabulary to find. I was no longer merely fixing his disastrous mess. I was actively building an inescapable, bulletproof glass box around his digital footprint. I maintained absolute, ruthless operational discipline regarding what information I shared with the executive leadership. When the board of directors demanded their frantic hourly updates, I fed them carefully measured, microscopic drops of technical progress. I gave them exactly enough stability to keep them desperately reliant on my presence in the building, but I deliberately withheld the full, comprehensive picture. I never pushed the visible recovery past 85%. If Evan realized I had completely secured the perimeter and locked down the database, he might panic, abandon his scheme, and alter his timeline. I needed him to believe his sabotage was still entirely viable. I needed him to feel comfortable and supremely confident. It was during one of those tense, artificial lulls that I made my first major external move. I stepped into an empty, soundproofed glass office down the hall and dialed the direct cellular line of the Chief Technology Officer at Bexley Home Clubs. His name was Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice vibrating with a cold, justified rage. He was fully prepared to terminate a logistics contract worth tens of millions of dollars. I did not offer him standard corporate apologies or empty marketing promises. I spoke to him exactly as one veteran engineer speaking to another. Marcus, your inbound freight routing is completely secure because I personally isolated your traffic flows from our central core, I told him, keeping my voice completely steady and authoritative. But I need you to listen to me very carefully right now. The total outage your warehouses experienced last night was not a random server failure or a standard migration error. It was an intentional, structural compromise initiated from inside this very building to force an extremely lucrative vendor migration. I am currently holding the line and protecting your data, but I require a strategic favor from you. Marcus remained silent for a long, heavy moment. When he finally spoke, the corporate anger had instantly evaporated, replaced by a sharp, calculating attention. What kind of favor are we talking about, Riley? I need you to act as an independent, unimpeachable witness, I explained. When the precise time comes, I need you to verify the exact chronological timeline of when your systems initially failed, and exactly when I personally bypassed our unified core to save your inventory from corruption. I need you to stand ready to deliver that testimony directly to our board of directors. If what you're saying is true, and someone intentionally jeopardized my supply chain for a kickback, Marcus replied smoothly, the threat implicit in his tone, you will have the full, unmitigated weight of Bexley Home Clubs standing directly behind you in that boardroom. I absolutely despise being used as collateral damage in someone else's amateur corporate scheme. I thanked him, terminated the connection, and walked back to the engineering bullpen. I had just successfully converted our most furious client into a devastating strategic asset. Shortly after midnight, a young identity and access management engineer nervously approached my desk. He looked absolutely terrified, his eyes darting toward the hallway every few seconds to ensure we were not being watched. He leaned down and confessed something that made the blood in my veins run completely ice cold. He quietly admitted that exactly 2 days before I was officially terminated, Evan had explicitly ordered him to leave my primary authentication token fully active in the background security repository. Evan had aggressively claimed it was strictly for transition convenience, citing a potential need to reference my historical permission structures. On paper, Human Resources had completely revoked my building access and terminated my employment. In the digital reality, a ghost version of my administrative credentials was left freely wandering the system, fully capable of executing catastrophic, system-ending commands. The frame-up was beautiful in its brutal, arrogant simplicity. Evan was going to use my ghost token to initiate the final fatal blow to the unified core. He would then proudly present the fabricated access logs to the board of directors, pointing directly at my digital fingerprint. He would convincingly declare that the disgruntled, unstable legacy architect they had recently fired had deliberately sabotaged the entire company out of pure, vindictive spite. It was the perfect narrative to absolve himself of all guilt while simultaneously securing his massive migration bonus. My immediate instinct was to open the directory, hunt down the ghost token, and permanently burn it to ashes. I wanted to delete the weapon before he could pull the trigger, but I physically stopped my hand before my fingers touched the keyboard. I stared at the blinking cursor on the black screen. The most supremely confident criminal is always the exact person who steps into the snare the fastest. If I deleted his fabricated weapon, he would simply panic and find another, less predictable way to destroy the system. I needed him to walk the exact path he had painstakingly planned. So, instead of deleting the token, I left it perfectly intact. I simply wrapped the ghost token in an audit layer that would capture its real point of origin the moment anyone used it. I turned his chosen weapon into a highly sensitive, radioactive tripwire. The moment he tried to use my name, the system would permanently record his actual physical location, his real machine address, and his exact keystrokes. The final, definitive shift in the power dynamic occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning. Vivian Hart slipped silently into the darkened engineering bullpen. The immaculate, untouchable chief executive officer looked utterly shattered. The terrifying realization that the board of directors was actively looking for a chief executive to sacrifice had finally overpowered her blind loyalty to her own ambitious growth narratives. She stood next to my desk, staring blankly at the floor, and began voluntarily feeding me every single piece of internal corporate strategy she possessed. Evan is aggressively pushing the board for an emergency vote tomorrow afternoon, Vivian whispered, her voice tight and entirely stripped of its usual commanding resonance. He is going to argue that your temporary regional patches are fundamentally failing under the pressure. He actually has the final, expedited contract from Cinderstack Solutions sitting right on his desk, completely ready for the chairman's signature. The board members are absolutely terrified of a second blackout. Riley, they are going to give him whatever he wants just to stop the bleeding and protect their portfolios. Let him push for the emergency vote, I replied calmly, not even bothering to look up from the complex routing tables displayed on my monitors. Tell the board whatever lies you need to tell them to keep your own head above the water for another 12 hours. But you must ensure one specific thing. You must guarantee that Evan is physically present in the main glass conference room when he makes his final presentation to the stakeholders. Vivian gave a slow, trembling nod and walked away into the shadows of the hallway. I leaned back in my chair and slowly surveyed the expansive humming room. The emotional and structural gravity of the entire corporate ecosystem had completely inverted. Just 48 hours ago, I was the obsolete dinosaur, escorted out of the lobby by a sympathetic security guard, entirely discarded by ambitious people who thought they owned the future of technology. Now the smartest engineers in the building looked directly to me for their professional survival. The largest retail clients in the country secretly reported directly to my personal cellular phone. The chief executive officer of a billion-dollar logistics empire was reduced to acting as my frightened, covert informant. I was no longer merely the architect of the software. I had quietly become the architect of their entire reality. I had painstakingly set the stage, aligned the witnesses, and loaded the forensic traps. I did not have to actively hunt Evan down anymore. All I had to do was sit back and patiently wait for him to proudly pull the trigger on a gun I had already meticulously unloaded. The atmosphere inside the executive boardroom at 9 in the morning was thick enough to choke on. We were gathered for the official recovery demonstration. The 12 members of the board of directors sat around the massive marble table, their faces illuminated by the harsh light of the main projection screen. Vivian sat rigid at the head of the table, gripping her pen like a weapon. Evan stood near the windows, vibrating with a nervous, predatory energy. I was standing at the podium, projecting the live operational health of the Eastern server cluster onto the wall. For the first 15 minutes, The presentation was flawless. The routing tables were perfectly stable. The inventory reconciliations were flowing smoothly, and the massive dashboard remained a calming, solid green. I was calmly explaining the quarantine protocols I had established, entirely aware of the trap waiting in the dark. At exactly 19 minutes past 9, the projection screen violently flickered. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the calming green interface shattered into a chaotic mosaic of harsh red warnings. The East Coast database cluster was suddenly rejecting incoming writes. The primary load balancers began to aggressively fail over, creating a localized bottleneck that immediately froze shipping manifests across 3 states. The air in the room instantly turned to solid ice. Before the chairman of the board could even open his mouth to demand an explanation, Evan Crow lunged forward. He slammed a thick stack of printed system logs onto the center of the marble table with a deafening crack. He did not look panicked. He looked coldly triumphant. "This is exactly what I warned you about," Evan shouted, his voice echoing off the acoustic panels. He pointed an accusatory finger directly at me. "She is not fixing the system. She is actively holding this entire corporation hostage. I pulled the directory access logs an hour ago. Look at the timestamps. Look at the digital signatures." The board members frantically pulled the papers toward them. At exactly 2 in the morning, while we were all desperately trying to save our client relationships, Riley's personal authentication token was used to inject a fatal loop command directly into the Eastern load balancer, Evan declared, pacing the length of the table like a prosecuting attorney delivering his closing argument. "She engineered this morning's failure. She is intentionally destabilizing the unified core right in front of us so she can legally stretch out her exorbitant $1,000 an hour emergency contract. She is milking us dry." For a few terrifying minutes, the entire room was paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the accusation. The board members exchanged deeply unsettled glances. The people who had just begun to trust my competence over the last 2 days suddenly recoiled. I watched Vivian. Her face was completely drained of color. I could see the desperate gears turning in her mind. If the board accepted Evan's fabricated narrative, she had an immediate, perfect escape route. She could push all the blame for the initial crash, the massive financial losses, and the subsequent failures directly onto me, washing her own hands entirely clean. She looked down at the logs, then up at me, her eyes hardening. She was preparing to throw me to the wolves. I did not raise my voice. I did not scramble to defend my honor. I simply turned back to my terminal and typed exactly 4 words into the command line interface. The projection screen behind me instantly cleared Evan's dashboard and replaced it with a stark, black terminal window filled with glowing white text. It was the raw output of my audit mirror. "Those logs Evan just handed you are technically accurate, but they are entirely incomplete," I announced, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. My authentication token did indeed execute that command. However, as human resources can verify, my physical token was deactivated and confiscated 2 days ago. So, the question is not what the token did, but who was secretly wearing it like a mask. I highlighted a specific block of code on the massive screen. This is an audit mirror. It is a read-only diagnostic layer I built into the system years ago. It records the true origin of every privileged command. Evan froze. The smug, triumphant sneer vanished from his face, replaced by absolute, unadulterated terror. He realized in a fraction of a second that he had stepped onto a landmine. "The mirror shows that the command did not originate from my terminal," I continued, methodically walking the board through the digital evidence. "It originated from a machine located in the executive suite on the 4th floor, specifically Evan's machine. He utilized a spoofed privilege path, tunneled through my retained ghost token, and deliberately triggered a minor routing error exactly when he knew you would all be watching." The chairman of the board stared at the screen, his jaw tight. Why would our director of operations technology intentionally crash his own system during a board presentation because he did not want to destroy the company? I explained smoothly. He just needed a highly theatrical loss of faith. He needed you to be so terrified of my supposed incompetence that you would instantly approve the emergency migration contract with Cinderstack Solutions today, guaranteeing him a $750,000 kickback. That is a complete fabrication, Evan screamed, his voice cracking violently. She is doctoring the terminal display. I did not even bother to look at him. I simply tapped a key, opening a secure video conference channel. The face of Marcus, the chief technology officer of Bexley Home Clubs, appeared on the screen, dwarfing everyone in the room. It is not a fabrication, Marcus's voice boomed through the high-fidelity ceiling speakers. The entire board physically jumped. Good morning, members of the board. I am speaking to you directly from Bexley headquarters. Yesterday afternoon, while your entire logistics network was violently burning to the ground, my office received a highly aggressive sales call from the regional vice president of Cinderstack Solutions. Marcus leaned closer to his camera, his expression dark and uncompromising. They offered to immediately transition our entire account off your servers, but what I found truly fascinating was their sales pitch. They possessed incredibly specific, highly classified knowledge regarding the internal structural weaknesses of your new unified core. They knew exactly how your Eastern cluster failed before your own support team even notified us. They had inside information, and they were actively circling your bleeding company like vultures. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The trap had closed with a deafening snap. Every single eye slowly turned from the video screen directly to Evan, who was now visibly shaking, backing slowly toward the glass door. The chairman slowly turned his heavy gaze toward Vivian. Vivian, did you know about this? Under the crushing weight of the board's collective fury, the unassailable chief executive officer finally shattered. She could not lie her way out of a room containing a forensic timeline, a furious major client, and a documented trail of money. I did not know about the kickback, Vivian confessed, her voice barely a hollow whisper. She slumped down into her expensive leather chair, burying her face in her hands. I swear I did not know he was going to intentionally crash the core, but I knew the migration was dangerous. Riley submitted 3 separate, highly detailed risk assessment binders warning me that the unified core would collapse under our current traffic volume. I chose to ignore them. I buried the reports because the private equity representatives demanded a story of aggressive, streamlined cost-cutting, and Evan promised me a beautiful narrative. She had finally admitted it out loud, on the official record, in front of the entire governing body of the corporation. While the board members erupted into furious, overlapping shouts, demanding immediate legal action and security intervention, I simply turned my back to the chaos. I placed my hands on my keyboard and went to work. I did not need hours to fix the Eastern cluster. I only needed 60 seconds. Because I had watched Evan plant the microscopic error in real time last night, I already had the exact countermeasure queued up and waiting in my terminal. I flushed the corrupted routing cache, severed the malicious loop Evan had created, and instantly restabilized the database tables. Behind me, the massive projection screen transitioned from the forensic code back to the operational dashboard. The harsh red warnings dissolved. The map of the eastern seaboard flooded with a bright, steady, undeniable green. I turned back to face the room. The shouting abruptly stopped as the board members realized the system was already completely healed. I had just turned a vicious corporate witch hunt into a raw, undeniable display of absolute technical supremacy. I was no longer just the woman holding the truth. I was the woman who completely controlled the exact moment that truth fell, crushing everything in its path. 2 hours after the morning presentation, completely shattered the illusion of the unified core. I walked back into the main executive boardroom for the final time. I was no longer alone, and I was certainly no longer playing defense. My personal attorney, a man whose expensive tailored suit cost more than most of the junior engineers made in an entire year, walked beside me. I carried a single, thick black leather portfolio. Inside that portfolio was the definitive, undeniable leverage I had spent the last 3 days meticulously gathering. It contained the sworn, written testimony from Marcus, the chief technology officer at Bexley Home Clubs. It held the complete, unredacted financial approval chain linking the expedited Cinderstack Solutions contract directly to the upper echelons of our executive leadership. But most importantly, it contained a highly detailed, legally binding licensing package for a proprietary system resilience framework I had officially named Ledger Shield. The 12 members of the board of directors were already seated. They looked like prisoners waiting for a judge to read their sentences. The air in the room was stale, heavy with the stench of millions of dollars evaporating into thin air. I did not wait for the chairman to invite me to speak. I walked directly to the head of the long marble table, opened my portfolio, and spread the documents out in a perfectly neat row. "I am not returning to my previous cubicle," I announced, my voice echoing off the dark wood panels with a cold, absolute finality. "I am not returning as an obedient, quietly discarded subordinate to a corporate hierarchy that deliberately engineered its own destruction just to line its pockets, and then attempted to use me as a convenient sacrificial lamb. If Stratodyne intends to survive the next 24 hours and keep its major retail clients from terminating their contracts, you are going to pay the actual, unmitigated market value for the intellect that just saved you." The chairman folded his hands over his stomach, his face grim. "What exactly are your terms, Riley?" I pushed the thickest document toward the center of the table. "This is Ledger Shield. It is the comprehensive architectural framework that caught your falling unified core last night. It is the exact methodology that has kept this company running at 99.99% uptime for the last decade. My first condition is that the intellectual property rights to Ledger Shield belong entirely, 100%. To me, Stratodyne will not own my brain. You will be permitted to purchase a perpetual, non-exclusive operational license to utilize the framework at a premium enterprise rate." Several board members shifted uncomfortably in their expensive leather chairs, their eyes darting to the legal document. I did not give them a single second to interrupt. "Second," I continued, pacing slowly behind my chair, "you will authorize the immediate creation of an independent system resilience office. This department will operate entirely outside the standard corporate hierarchy. It will not report to the Director of Operations Technology, and it will not report to the Chief Executive Officer. It will report directly and exclusively to this board, ensuring that no ambitious executive can ever quietly bypass our safety controls for a marketing narrative again. I will serve as the interim director of this office until a suitable replacement is trained." My lawyer stepped forward, resting his hands on the table. "Third, my client requires the immediate, full payment of her emergency rescue fee, billed at $1,000 per hour, encompassing the full guaranteed minimum of 200 hours. Furthermore, Stratodyne will issue a comprehensive, company-wide public memorandum. This document will detail exactly why Riley was terminated, definitively clear her name of any wrongdoing, and publicly restore her professional reputation. And fourth," I said, leaning over the marble table to look directly at the private equity representatives, "you will initiate immediate termination proceedings for Evan Crow. Specifically citing malicious cause and gross negligence, you will void all of his severance packages and cancel his unvested equity shares. Following that, you will authorize a comprehensive financial audit to execute clawback provisions on the performance bonuses of any executive leader who actively ignored formally documented risk controls prior to this engineered crisis." A heavy-set board member sitting on the far right slammed his open palm down on the marble surface. His face was red with indignation. "This is blatant extortion," the man growled, pointing a thick finger at me. "You are actively exploiting a catastrophic corporate crisis to force our hand. You are inflating your own price tag and attempting to hijack our internal operational structure while we have a gun to our heads." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply stared at him until the silence in the room became physically unbearable. "You exploited my dedication and my silence for nearly 2 decades, I replied, my words striking the air like a hammer on an anvil. "You exploited my invisible labor to build a fraudulent, highly lucrative growth narrative for your portfolios. You threw me out into the cold street the exact second you decided my competence was a liability to your upcoming funding round. Do not dare lecture me about extortion. I am simply matching your exact business model. The only difference between yesterday and today is that you no longer possess the leverage to exploit me. The angry board member opened his mouth to argue, but the chairman shot him a warning glare that instantly silenced him. They knew I had them entirely backed into a corner. Vivian Hart, who had been sitting in paralyzed silence at the far end of the table, suddenly stood up. Her immaculate posture was gone. "I request a brief, private recess with Riley," Vivian said, her voice shaking slightly. The chairman nodded, and I followed Vivian out of the boardroom and into a small, adjoining glass meeting space. She closed the heavy door, instantly cutting off the ambient noise of the building. She looked completely hollowed out, the polished armor of her executive persona entirely stripped away. "Riley, please," Vivian whispered, her eyes pleading. "I know my career here is completely over. I know the board is going to demand my resignation. I will step down quietly. I will sign whatever non-compete agreements they want, but please, do not drag my name through a massive public civil suit. Give me a clean exit. Allow me to leave with a fraction of my dignity." I looked at the woman who had coldly slid my termination papers across a desk just 3 days ago. I did not offer her a single ounce of easy forgiveness. "Your dignity is no longer my concern, Vivian," I stated coldly. "I will give you exactly one option. When we return to that boardroom for the final public session, you will stand up and dictate the entire, unvarnished truth directly into the official corporate record. You will admit that you ignored my warnings, that you approved the accelerated Cinderstack timeline, and that you prioritized a false narrative over the survival of the company. If you do that, I will not actively pursue the harsher personal civil claims against you. But if you try to minimize your involvement by a single syllable, if you attempt to shift the blame to anyone else, I will absolutely bankrupt you." She closed her eyes, a single tear cutting through her perfect makeup, and gave a slow, defeated nod. I turned away from her and looked through the glass walls, out into the main corridor. The entire engineering department, the operations managers, the junior developers, and the floor supervisors were standing out there. They were packed shoulder to shoulder, filling the hallway. They were completely silent, watching the glass rooms, holding their collective breath to see if the woman who had just fought a brutal war to save their jobs was going to be sold out behind closed doors yet again. They did not need to worry. I was not going to be sold out, because as I walked back toward the main boardroom doors, my hand brushed against the black leather portfolio. The board thought they had seen all my cards. They thought the Cinderstack money trail and the audit mirror logs were the grand finale of my revenge. They were entirely wrong. Tucked in the very back flap of my folder, hidden beneath the licensing agreements, was one final piece of evidence. I had not revealed it to my lawyer, and I had certainly not revealed it to the board. It was a digital artifact so damning, so fundamentally destructive, that it would not merely bury Evan Crow professionally. It was a lock that would permanently seal the jaws of absolutely anyone on that board who might try to spin this entire nightmare as a simple, unfortunate management error. I was just waiting for the exact right moment, when every single one of them was trapped in the same room, to drop the final guillotine. When we finally walked back into the grand executive boardroom for the ultimate decision session, the ambient temperature in the room felt as though it had dropped by 10 degrees. The 12 members of the board of directors were seated exactly where I had left them, but their previous expressions of arrogant irritation had entirely dissolved. They now wore the grim, exhausted faces of people who had stared directly into a massive financial abyss and realized they had absolutely no choice but to pay the toll to cross it. I walked to the head of the heavy marble table, my lawyer standing silently right behind my right shoulder. The chairman of the board folded his hands over the pristine wood surface. He did not look at Evan, and he did not look at me. He looked directly at the woman sitting at the far end of the table. "Vivian," the chairman said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth, "you requested to make a formal statement for the corporate record before we proceed with the contractual voting. Vivian Hart stood up. The immaculate, untouchable chief executive officer who had so coldly slid my termination papers across a desk just a few days prior was completely gone. Her shoulders were slumped, and her hands gripped the edge of the marble table so tightly that her knuckles were entirely white. She took a slow, trembling breath, forcing herself to look directly at the private equity representatives who held her entire career in their hands. I am formally admitting to this board that I authorized the termination of our senior reliability architect without proper technical cause, Vivian stated, her voice shaking slightly but carrying through the silent room. Furthermore, I deliberately withheld and suppressed 4 separate, highly detailed risk assessment reports. These reports explicitly warned that the unified core architecture would violently collapse under our fourth quarter traffic volume. I chose to ignore those warnings. I actively pushed Evan to accelerate his consolidation plan because I wanted a beautiful, streamlined narrative of corporate restructuring to present to our investors before the next round of funding. She paused, swallowing hard, her eyes fixed entirely on the polished table. I prioritized a marketing story over the physical survival of our infrastructure. I am responsible for creating the environment that allowed this catastrophic event to occur. Before the board members could even process the sheer magnitude of her confession, Evan Crow violently pushed his chair back. The heavy wood scraped against the carpet with a deafening screech. "She is lying to save her own skin," Evan shouted, his voice cracking into a high, frantic pitch. He pointed a shaking finger toward me, sweat clearly visible on his forehead. "This is a coordinated witch hunt. The modernization strategy was completely sound. Everything that happened last night was simply a migration failure caused by an entirely unpredictable, bloated legacy system. She built an incomprehensible maze of code, and it collapsed under its own weight. I was trying to save this corporation from her outdated architecture. I did not raise my voice to argue with him. I did not need to defend my code anymore. I simply reached into the back pocket of my portfolio and pulled out a small encrypted digital audio player. I placed it gently on the marble table, connected it via a wireless bridge to the boardroom's central communication system, and pressed the silver play button. I extracted this specific audio file from the highly secured internal emergency conference archives, I announced to the silent room. This conversation was recorded exactly 3 hours before the Eastern database cluster experienced its first localized panic. The high-fidelity ceiling speakers crackled softly, and then Evan's voice echoed through the cavernous boardroom. It was not the frantic, defensive voice he was using now. It was the low, arrogant, conspiratorial tone he used when he thought he was completely untouchable. "Do not worry about the board," the recorded version of Evans said. "If the Eastern cluster stumbles tonight, they will panic and sign the Cinderstack migration by morning." I pressed the silver button again, cutting the audio feed. The silence that descended upon the boardroom was absolute and terrifying. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a trap snapping entirely shut. Combined with the immutable forensic logs, the illegally retained authentication token, the disabled security alerts, the anonymous code injection, the financial paper trail leading directly to Cinderstack Solutions, and Vivian's complete, unvarnished confession. The entire schematic of his corporate treason fit together with flawless, devastating precision. It was an unbreakable lock, and I had just turned the final key. The chairman of the board stood up, his face a mask of cold, unadulterated fury. He looked at Evan with the absolute disgust usually reserved for a dangerous parasite. "Evan Crow," the chairman declared, his voice booming with authority. "The board of directors is hereby voting to suspend your employment at Stratodyne Fulfillment Systems, effective this exact second, pending immediate termination for gross negligence, fraud, and deliberate corporate sabotage. We are transferring this entire evidentiary dossier directly to our outside legal counsel for severe civil and potential criminal prosecution." Evan opened his mouth, his face completely pale, but absolutely no sound came out. He looked wildly around the room, but every single face staring back at him was carved from solid stone. The chairman then turned his heavy gaze toward the far end of the table. Vivian, the board is officially initiating formal procedures for your immediate removal as Chief Executive Officer, citing the deliberate concealment of material operational risks. You will clear out your office by the end of the day. The chairman finally turned to me. He reached inside his suit jacket, pulled out a heavy silver fountain pen, and slid it across the smooth marble surface until it stopped right in front of my portfolio. We accept your terms in their entirety, the chairman said quietly. I did not smile. I did not offer any gracious corporate pleasantries. I simply opened the portfolio and watched as they legally surrendered to every single condition I had set. They signed the perpetual premium licensing agreement for LedgerShield, officially legally binding the future of their infrastructure to my personal intellectual property. They signed the financial authorization for the complete payment of my emergency rescue fee. They signed the company-wide memorandum that would immediately broadcast my complete exoneration and the restoration of my professional reputation. And finally, they signed the executive order establishing the Independent System Resilience Office, granting me absolute, unquestioned leadership over the very architecture they had tried to strip away from me. The image from my termination returned in reverse. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows and watched as two corporate security officers entered the boardroom. This time, they did not come for me. They went straight to Evan and Vivian, collected their phones and laptops, and took their access badges on the spot. I watched as the highly ambitious executives who had confidently declared me an obsolete bottleneck were physically escorted out of the glass doors. Out in the main hallway, the entire engineering department, the operations managers, and the junior developers were packed shoulder to shoulder. They parted like the sea to let the security guards through. The employees watched the architects of their misery perform the ultimate walk of shame in absolute dead silence. Hours later, when the frantic corporate dust had finally settled and the building was mostly empty, I took the elevator down to the third floor. I walked through the heavy security doors and stepped out onto the main server floor. The massive, industrial cooling fans roared with a steady, deafening, comforting rhythm. The endless rows of server racks blinked with a beautiful, synchronized ocean of green lights. I walked slowly down the long, freezing aisle and reached out, resting my bare hand directly against the cold metal of the Eastern Cluster cabinet. These machines, holding the lifeblood of a billion-dollar supply chain, had almost been casually sold for scrap parts, just to feed the boundless greed of a man who did not even understand how they worked. As I stood there in the cold room, I realized with absolute certainty that I had not just saved a collection of databases and routing tables. I had completely overthrown an arrogant corporate system that fundamentally believed the truth was just another disposable metric that could be easily marketed and repackaged. The woman they had so proudly declared obsolete was now the only person holding the master keys to the future of their entire empire. The executives who had desperately wanted to erase my name from their history were now legally forced to survive entirely beneath the protective umbrella of the technology framework I owned. The servers had crashed for only one single, terrifying night, but an entire, corrupt order of corporate power had permanently collapsed in that final minute. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please leave a comment letting me know where in the world you are listening from so we can interact and share our thoughts together. I also invite you to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and show your support by pressing the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many more people.